Suffrage is the right to vote in political elections. It was a right denied to all women, whatever their status. The franchise determined the qualifications needed in order to have the right to vote and was property-based. Women were subject to coverture, under which married women had no rights or legally recognised separate identity from that of her husband. Successive Reform Acts in 1832, 1867 and 1884 extended the franchise for men, but still denied all women the vote. Societies promoting women's suffrage from the mid-19th century came together as the NSWS in 1867. Ideological and political differences leading to splits and new societies forming were all undermining the effectiveness of the movement, especially after the death of Lydia Becker in 1890. By 1894, successive Married Women's Property Acts and Municipal Franchise Acts had removed the issues of coverture and given women, within a limited franchise, the right to vote in local government elections and sit on councils, education boards and to act as poor law guardians. In 1897, the women's suffrage movement re-energised itself and the main suffrage societies reunited as the non-political NUWSS Federation under the leadership of Millicent Garrett Fawcett. Women's rights, as seen in a cartoon from Punch in 1901. It's sometimes easy for us to confuse the terms suffragist and suffragette and to use them wrongly. A suffragist is a person who promoted the extension of political voting rights, especially in respect of women, by means of reasoned arguments and law-abiding demonstrations. A suffragette is a woman who campaigned for the extension of political voting rights for women and was prepared to use militant action in pursuit of that goal. In 1903, Mrs. Pankhurst established the Women's Social and Political Union. Its motto was deeds, not words. The term suffragette was coined by the headline-hungry Daily Mail newspaper in 1906 to describe the militant members of the WSPU. The Women's Freedom League was led by Mrs. Charlotte Despard after the split with the WSPU. It was a militant organisation, but dissociated itself from the increasingly violent activities against persons and property committed by the WSPU. Marjory Lees of Oldham Park was president of the very active Oldham Women's Suffrage Society. Marjory's mother was Sarah Lees, the country's second Lady Mayor in 1910, and both were already well known and respected for their generous financial support of charities and their work on numerous welfare, education and political reform committees, as poor law guardians and on school boards. 1913 was the year in which the NUWSS felt the need to prove to the country that not all suffragists were violent and anarchic in their activities, that the so-called suffragettes were in a tiny minority. They needed to win back the popular support that had been lost. In the January, the NUWSS decided to organise a massive pilgrimage of non-militant suffragists from all corners of the country to meet up in London on the 26th of July for a mass demonstration in Hyde Park. Fortunately for us, Marjory Lees recorded the happenings of the next 21 days in her diary. And the photos are from the album commemorating her presidency of the Oldham Women's Suffrage Society. The pilgrims would walk, ride on bikes and horses, or in cars and caravans, all converging in London on the 26th of July. En route, they would stop regularly to give lectures, hold debates and pass out literature. This was a brave undertaking because most meetings at which any mention of women's suffrage was made resulted in some abuse and often rough handling of the speakers. The pilgrimage would prove to be no exception. Decent food and a comfortable bed, whenever possible, seem to have been important considerations and get plenty of mentions. Marjory Lees always refers to herself as ML in the diary. The entries concern the day's activities, the weather, food, and whether it was good, bad or indifferent, the meetings and the mixed receptions of welcome and hostility with both verbal and physical abuse at times. The extracts quoted from the diary are all fairly typical, matter-of-fact detail tinged with some quiet humour. There appear to have been 2 caravans for their little party, pulled by the horses Noah and Ham, and nicknamed the Ark. Scholes and another man were along to look after the horses and vans. The Oldham contingent set off on the morning of Monday 7th of July and met up at Clegg Street Station for the train to Stockport. With Marjory were Mrs. Bridge, Miss Annie Dixon, Miss Field, Mrs. Fletcher, Miss E. Sharples, Mrs. Siddall and Mrs. Tuke, 8 in all. 64 of them, plus a band, set off from Mersey Square to walk to Poynton under their first public meeting. Later, and in Macclesfield, she wrote, "A large and noisy crowd collected round the town hall and amused itself with lustily booing every pilgrim who showed herself. The evening meeting was packed and an overflow meeting was held." Mrs. Siddall and a policeman had a procession to themselves when she went to fetch her bag after the meeting. She was followed by a booing crowd. It took 8 policemen to get Mrs. Fletcher and her niece through, and they got a lot of dirt thrown at them. On Wednesday, they passed through the Potteries, and in Golden Hill she wrote that "some of the women denounced us loudly as a disgrace to our sex, and one of them went so far as to say we ought all to be drowned, and held to that opinion even after I had explained to her what inoffensive people we were. So I told her she was as bad as the militants, and she had to laugh." Altogether, we have a happy recollection of Golden Hill. The Tunstall stop went well, but not so well at Burslem, and she wrote, "Immediately after the meeting, we formed up and marched on to Hanley at a quick pace. The procession was certainly not dignified, and resembled Oldham's cycle parade more than anything else. Our collectors and distributors dodged in and out of the crowds at top speed." On Friday, she wrote that Mrs. Bridges and ML took the motor to Wolverhampton station and took the train back to Oldham. What she doesn't mention in her diary is that she returned to Oldham for the royal visit and to be presented to the King and Queen along with her mother. On Sunday, returning to Birmingham and the pilgrimage, she wrote, "The 4 Oldham pilgrims who had strayed from the fold met at Clegg Street Station for the 3:57 train to Birmingham and had quite a send-off." On Monday of the 2nd week, she wrote, "Assembled at the suffrage offices, had a good send-off, then marched to Alton. An enterprising photographer took a group." Entries for the next few days are of Warwick, Leamington and Stratford, with a mix of good and bad receptions. But it wasn't all serious business, and heading towards Banbury on Friday at lunchtime, she wrote, "There was a wide stretch of grass and some shady trees under which we drew up the vans and had a good lunch of sandwiches, cakes and jelly. We set the table and from its extreme ricketiness judged that we were on a slope. Mrs. Fletcher and Annie had been promising themselves toasted cheese ever since the start, so they really made it this time. Annie was getting down with the plate in her hand when the slice of toast slid right off onto the grass below. One piece fell butter side up and the other butter side down. One could be eaten, but the other had to be abandoned. Soon after that, Mrs. Fletcher's chair, with her in it, went over sideways. Fortunately, she had the presence of mind not to clutch the table, which only maintained its equilibrium through ML and Mrs. Bridge each grasping a leg. After that, a shower of cakes fell upon us from the caravan. Last but not least, after the washing up, AD sat on her hat after having warned everybody else not to do so. Next day, back to reality and the daily grind, and after dinner at a hotel in Oxford, she wrote that they went to the meeting at the town hall, which was packed. The pilgrims entered from the back of the hall and walked up the central passage to the platform amidst cheers and booing. There was a very noisy element in the room, and we began to expect a rough time. The resolution was put and carried in spite of the efforts of the white-haired leader of the anti-suffragists. Most of Monday passed without undue excitement. They reached Thame, set up camp and also pitched a tent. Feeling tired, they decided to skip the evening meeting and relax. However, she wrote, "We were just ready to undress when the booing and shouting came our way. Millie rushed in with the welcome news that there were 2 policemen on the ground and that we had better put our light out, which we promptly did, and got our door locked pretty quickly, but had not time to fasten our windows. It was a weird experience. We sat in the dark as far back in the van as we could, holding the windows and blinds. The policeman said about 150 came down and made a fine old row with horns, hooting and booing. It seemed to us to go on for a very long time, but I don't suppose it was really more than 20 minutes. At last they got tired, as nothing was to be seen or heard of us, and went off crying out, 'Good night, you suffragettes!' Some of us undressed, and some of us didn't, and then we slept, more or less." The next day in High Wycombe was even worse, and she wrote, "At 7 we formed up and marched into High Wycombe behind the town band. As we got nearer the town, the character of the crowd quite changed. I never saw so many evil faces gathered together. ES and ML and about half a dozen others were sent before the band to set the pace. The policemen did not go in front to keep the way clear as they had done in other places, and the crowd pressed right upon us. When we got to the fountain where the open-air meeting was to be held, the pressure was tremendous, and we didn't know where to halt. We went to the end of the square, and then some of the banner bearers began to furl their banners, and the crowd surrounded them, so we slipped off unnoticed and followed Miss Collum and her horse, who was being personally conducted. We found our vans at the top and got to bed early." Wednesday, and another uneventful day as they made their way towards Beaconsfield and their caravans, but they had a surprise when, as she wrote, "We were just getting into bed when a manly voice asked if we were all right. It was Mottram and Fairbrother, whom Mother had dispatched to rescue us after seeing an alarming paragraph in the Manchester Guardian." On Friday their pilgrimage was coming to an end, and horses and men would be travelling home on the train. Marjory wrote, "Noah was so interested in town life we could hardly get him along. It was 5:15 when we reached St Pancras." Saturday 26th was the great and final day, and taken from her more detailed account of the day, we know that we started about 1:30 for the place of assembly. ML and ES carried the banner, which was much admired. The procession was a long one. There were plenty of bands, and the way did not seem so long. At Hyde Park there were 19 platforms, Manchester Federation being number 10. It was a fine sight to see the processions coming in from the different sides. The crowds were quite orderly, and the resolution passed at each platform with only a handful of dissensions. What an anticlimax Sunday must have seemed. It was a day of church services and tea at the Lyceum Club. On the 12:10 train back to Oldham the next day, Marjory wrote, with what must have been a great deal of satisfaction, that ML spent the time in the train in reading excellent accounts of the demonstration in the various papers.